During a family dinner, as everyone sat at the table, I was serving food and accidentally bumped into my mother-in-law. She slapped me so hard in front of everyone and grabbed the warm soup and poured it all over my head and shouted, "How dare you touch me? Get on your knees and start cleaning, you disgusting woman." To my shock, my husband shouted, "Do what she says, otherwise leave." Then my sister-in-law stood up and grabbed me by the hair and started dragging me out while kicking my back. Uncle-in-law nodded, "Some women just need physical lessons." So I left the dinner. But when they got back home, a shocking surprise awaited them. I need to write this down while my hands are still shaking. The soup was tomato bisque, and I can still smell it in my hair even after 3 showers. My scalp burns where Patricia yanked out chunks of my hair. The left side of my face throbs from where Helen's palm connected with my cheekbone. But none of that compares to the look in Marcus's eyes when he told me to obey his mother or get out. Let me start from the beginning because this didn't happen in a vacuum. This was 5 years of poison finally erupting through the surface. I met Marcus Caldwell at a hospital fundraiser in Chicago. He was charming, successful, and seemed different from the finance brothers I usually encountered. He worked as an architect, talked about designing affordable housing, and claimed he wanted to change the world. His family owned a construction company that had been operating in Illinois for 3 generations. Old money, but not so old that they'd forgotten how to make more of it. The red flags appeared during our engagement, but I was 26 and stupidly in love. Helen Caldwell made it clear from day one that nobody would ever be good enough for her precious son. At our first dinner together, she sent back her wine 3 times and made the server cry. Marcus said nothing. His father Richard had checked out of Family Dynamics years ago, hiding behind his newspaper and bourbon. Patricia, Marcus's younger sister, studied me like I was a specimen under glass, already calculating how to maintain her position as the family princess. Marcus proposed on a beach in Michigan, just the 2 of us watching the sunset over Lake Michigan. It was perfect and private, everything I'd wanted. Then we got back to Chicago and Helen insisted on throwing an engagement party. She invited 200 people I'd never met, displayed the ring like a museum piece, and introduced me to her friends as Marcus's little nurse girlfriend. The condescension dripped from every word. Planning the wedding became a full-time job on top of my actual full-time job. Helen had opinions about everything. The invitations I'd chosen were too casual. The flowers I wanted were too common. My maid of honor Jennifer was not the right caliber for the bridal party. She suggested I ask Patricia to be my maid of honor instead. When I refused, Helen stopped speaking to me for 2 weeks. Marcus begged me to apologize for upsetting his mother. I did, even though I'd done nothing wrong. First compromise of many. The dress shopping expedition remains one of the worst days of my life. Helen brought 8 of her friends to the appointment. They sat in a semicircle while I tried on gowns, offering commentary that ranged from backhanded compliments to outright insults. That one makes you look heavier. The neckline is too revealing for a church wedding. Are you sure you want sleeveless? Your arms are a bit soft. I tried on 14 dresses before Helen finally approved one I hated. It was conservative, expensive, and made me look like I was playing dress-up in someone else's fantasy. I wore it anyway because fighting Helen was exhausting and Marcus refused to intervene. Our honeymoon was supposed to be 2 weeks in Greece. We managed 4 days before Helen called crying about some crisis with a construction company that required Marcus's immediate return. The crisis turned out to be a scheduling conflict that Richard could have easily handled. We flew home early, and I never got to see Santorini. Marcus promised we'd go back for our first anniversary. We didn't. The wedding was Helen's production. She vetoed my dress choice, my flowers, my venue. My own mother died when I was 19, so I had no one to fight these battles for me. My father had remarried and moved to Florida, more interested in his new wife's grandchildren than attending my wedding planning sessions. I told myself it didn't matter. Marriage was about Marcus and me, right? Wrong. Marriage was apparently about me becoming unpaid labor for the Caldwell family empire. It started small. Helen would call at 7 in the morning asking me to pick up her dry cleaning. Patricia needed rides to the salon because her car was acting weird. Richard required someone to organize his home office. Always me, never Marcus. When I suggested he help his own family, he'd sigh and say I was being difficult. His career was demanding. His family needed support. Wasn't I supposed to be a team player? The requests escalated. Helen needed me to coordinate her charity galas, which meant hours of unpaid event planning. Patricia expected me to babysit her designer dogs whenever she traveled, never mind that I worked night shifts and needed sleep. Richard wanted me to handle his personal correspondence, responding to emails and organizing his calendar. I became their assistant, their servant, their scapegoat whenever anything went wrong. One particularly awful week, I worked 4 consecutive night shifts at the hospital. 12 hours each, dealing with a flu outbreak that had the pediatric ward completely overwhelmed. I came home Thursday morning, dead on my feet, and found 17 missed calls from Helen. When I called back, she screamed at me for being irresponsible and unreliable. She needed me to take her to a doctor's appointment. Never mind that she had a driver. Never mind that I'd been saving children's lives. I'd failed in my duty to her, and that was unforgivable. Marcus came home that evening to find me crying at the kitchen table. I explained what had happened, expecting sympathy or support. Instead, he said, "You could have texted her back." She was worried. Not an apology for his mother's behavior. Not acknowledgement of my exhaustion. Just criticism that I hadn't managed the situation better. That's when the foundation started to crack. Little fissures I tried to ignore, hoping they wouldn't spread. I worked full-time as a pediatric nurse, rotating through brutal 12-hour shifts, but somehow that didn't count as a real job in Helen's eyes. Playing with babies all day, she called it. Never mind that I held dying children's hands and explained to devastated parents why their son or daughter wouldn't be coming home. Never mind the emotional toll or the physical exhaustion. The dinner parties became a monthly obligation. Helen insisted on hosting at her mansion in Winnetka, and Marcus insisted I attend. My job was to help cook, serve, and clean while the family entertained business associates and friends. I wasn't a daughter-in-law at these events. I was staff. At one particularly humiliating dinner, Helen introduced me to her guests as the help Marcus married. She laughed like it was a joke. Nobody corrected her. Marcus just smiled awkwardly and changed the subject. I spent that entire evening in the kitchen, preparing course after course while Patricia's friends gossiped loudly about how unfortunate it was that Marcus had settled for someone so ordinary. The other wives at these dinners pitied me. I could see it in their eyes when I cleared their plates or refilled their wine glasses. Some of them had been where I was, ground down by the Caldwell family machine before escaping through divorce or outlasting their husbands. One woman, Barbara, pulled me aside during a party and whispered, "Get out while you're young enough to start over." I thanked her and went back to scrubbing pots, pretending I hadn't heard the desperation in her voice. Helen had a particular talent for public humiliation. She'd correct my grammar at dinner parties. She'd criticize my clothes in front of guests. Once, she actually sent me home to change because my dress was too casual for the evening, even though Marcus had told me it was fine. I drove back to our house, changed into something more formal, and returned an hour later to find everyone already eating. Helen smiled sweetly and said, "Oh good, you're back. The dishes are piling up in the kitchen." Patricia learned from her mother. She'd accidentally spill drinks on me and apologize with a smirk. She'd make jokes about my profession, asking if I'd checked any of the dinner guests for head lice. She'd invite me to lunch and then cancel at the last minute, after I'd already taken time off work. Every interaction was a tiny cut, designed to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy. Marcus would promise things would change. After the holidays. After the big project. After his promotion. 5 years of after and nothing ever changed. The promises were just pressure release valves, little puffs of hope to keep me compliant for another few months. Last month something inside me finally cracked. I told Marcus I wanted us to move across town, create some distance, establish boundaries. His face went cold in a way I'd never seen before. "You want me to abandon my family?" he asked. "After everything they've done for us?" Everything they'd done for us. The wedding I didn't want. The house down the street from Helen that kept me on call 24/7. The job opportunities for Marcus that kept him working 80-hour weeks at the family company instead of pursuing his passion for sustainable architecture. Some gifts come with chains attached, but I stayed. I stayed because I'd invested 5 years. I stayed because my father would say I told you so about marrying too quickly. I stayed because I kept thinking the man I fell in love with would reappear. 3 days ago, Helen called with her usual imperial summons. Family dinner on Saturday. Be there at 4 to help with preparations. Guests would arrive at 7. I had just finished a string of night shifts and could barely keep my eyes open, but Marcus assured me it would be fine. "Just a small gathering," he said. "You won't have to do much." 17 people showed up. I spent 3 hours in Helen's kitchen while she criticized everything I did. The vegetables weren't chopped uniformly. The sauce needed more salt. Could I try not to be so clumsy with the china? Patricia sat at the kitchen island, scrolling through her phone and offering commentary. "Mom, I think she's burning the reduction." The presentation looks kind of amateur, doesn't it? Marcus stayed in the living room with his father and uncle, drinking scotch and laughing about something I couldn't hear. Every time I caught his eye through the doorway, he'd smile and look away. Not a real smile. The kind you give strangers in elevators. By the time we sat down for dinner, my feet ached and my head pounded. But the worst was yet to come. Helen had seated me at the far end of the table, as far from Marcus as possible. I was positioned between Harold, Richard's brother who reeked of cigar smoke, and Patricia's husband Kyle, who spent the entire first course complaining about his Tesla's charging time. Harold was particularly unpleasant company. He kept making comments about how women today didn't understand their proper role in supporting their husbands. His own wife had died 3 years earlier, and I suspect she'd welcomed the escape. He leaned too close when he talked, his breath a mixture of scotch and those expensive cigars. At one point, he put his hand on my knee under the table. I moved away. He smirked like it was all a game. Kyle wasn't much better. Patricia's husband was a hedge fund manager who treated conversation like a competition he had to win. He corrected everything I said, explained things I already understood, and made sure everyone knew he'd graduated from Wharton. Patricia had married her male equivalent, and they deserved each other. Between courses, I watched them exchange glances across the table, those little smiles that couples share when they're united in their contempt for someone else. The other guests were a blur of expensive clothes and fake smiles. Business associates of Richard's, mostly. A couple who owned a chain of luxury car dealerships. A developer who'd worked with the Caldwell Company on several projects. Helen's book club friends, who clutched their pearls and sipped wine while judging everyone around them. These were the people who mattered to the Caldwell family. These were the witnesses to my humiliation. The main course was my responsibility to serve. Helen had made it clear that she expected restaurant-level presentation. I carried out the soup tureen carefully, placing bowls in front of each guest. The tomato bisque was actually perfect, rich and creamy with fresh basil from Helen's garden. For a moment I felt something like pride. Helen sat at the head of the table like a queen holding court, wearing enough diamonds to fund a small country. She was telling some story about the incompetence of her housekeeper, gesturing wildly with her wine glass. As I leaned in to place a bowl in front of Harold, Helen threw her arm back in one of her dramatic flourishes. Her elbow hit my forearm. The bowl tilted. 3 drops of soup landed on her silk sleeve. The table went silent. Helen looked at her sleeve, then at me. Her face transformed into something ugly and ancient. Before I could apologize, before I could even process what had happened, her hand flew up and cracked across my face. The sound echoed through the dining room. My head snapped to the side. My ear rang. For a second I couldn't see anything but white spots dancing across my vision. "How dare you?" Helen hissed. Then she stood, grabbed the entire soup tureen from my hands, and dumped it over my head. The soup was still hot. Not scalding, thank God, but hot enough that I gasped. It soaked through my hair, ran down my face, dripped onto my dress. Chunks of tomato slid down my shoulders. The smell was overwhelming. "Get on your knees and start cleaning, you disgusting woman." Helen's voice cut through my shock. I looked around the table. 17 faces stared back at me. Some looked uncomfortable. Most looked curious, like they were watching an interesting television show. Nobody moved. Then I heard Marcus's voice. My husband. My partner. The man who had promised to love and protect me. "Do what she says, or leave." The words didn't make sense at first. I turned to look at him, soup dripping from my hair onto my neck. He wouldn't meet my eyes. His jaw was clenched, his hands gripping his knife and fork like weapons. "Marcus?" My voice came out small and broken. "You heard me. Either apologize properly or get out. You've embarrassed us enough." Something died in my chest. I could actually feel it, this tiny light I'd been carrying, guttering out like a candle in a hurricane. I started to turn toward the kitchen to get cleaning supplies. Maybe if I just did what they wanted, we could fix this later. Maybe this was all a nightmare and I'd wake up. Patricia's chair scraped against the hardwood floor. She stood up, walked around the table, and grabbed a handful of my hair. The pain was immediate and blinding. She yanked me toward the door, my feet scrambling to keep up. My hands flew to my head, trying to ease the pressure, but she just gripped harder. "Pathetic," she spat, and kicked me between the shoulder blades. I stumbled forward, catching myself on the doorframe. She kicked me again, this time in the lower back. I went down on one knee. The hallway floor was cold and hard beneath my palm. Harold's voice drifted from the dining room, casual as if commenting on the weather. Some women just need physical lessons. Can't teach respect with words alone. A murmur of agreement rippled through the dinner guests. I pulled myself to my feet and ran. Through the foyer, out the front door, into the cold October night. I didn't have my purse. I didn't have my phone. I didn't have my keys. I had soup in my hair and shame burning through every cell of my body. The night air hit me like a slap. I was wearing a thin dress, soaked through with tomato bisque, and the temperature had dropped to maybe 40 degrees. My heels clicked against the sidewalk as I stumbled away from that house, from those people, from the life I'd been living. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. Winnetka at night is beautiful in that sterile, wealthy way. Perfect lawns. Perfect houses. Perfect facades hiding perfectly miserable people. I walked past mansions with their lights glowing warm behind expensive curtains, past luxury cars in circular driveways, past the kind of neighborhood where people call the police if they saw someone who didn't belong. I probably looked like I didn't belong. Soup-covered, crying, walking without purpose through streets designed for people who drove everywhere. My hair dripped onto my shoulders. The soup was cooling now, going from uncomfortable to disgusting. I could smell the basil, the cream, the tomatoes. Every step made my feet hurt worse. These heels were meant for standing in kitchens, not walking miles through suburban streets. But I kept going because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant breaking into pieces right there on the sidewalk. I walked for 20 minutes before a convenience store clerk let me use their phone. I called my friend Jennifer, another nurse from the hospital. She picked me up without asking questions, took me to her apartment, let me shower and gave me clothes. The clerk had looked at me with concern and pity. "Are you okay? Do you need me to call the police?" A young guy, maybe 22, working the night shift at a 7-Eleven. He showed me more kindness in 30 seconds than my husband's family had shown me in 5 years. I told him I was fine, just needed to make a call. He handed me his personal cell phone and pretended to organize the cigarettes behind the counter while I dialed Jennifer's number from memory. Jennifer answered on the second ring. "Hello? It's me." My voice cracked. "Can you come get me?" She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask why I was calling from a strange number. She just asked where I was and said she'd be there in 15 minutes. That's friendship. That's what love actually looks like when it's real. I stood outside the convenience store, shivering, while the clerk watched me through the window. He'd offered to let me wait inside, but I needed the cold air to keep me focused. If I got comfortable, if I let myself feel safe for even a moment, I'd fall apart. And I couldn't fall apart yet. There was too much to do. Jennifer pulled up in her Honda Civic, and I'd never been so happy to see that dented passenger door. She leaned over and opened it from the inside. I climbed in, and she didn't say anything about the soup smell or my ruined makeup or the way I was shaking. She just turned up the heat, handed me her jacket, and drove. Then I asked to borrow her laptop. Here's what the Caldwell family didn't know about me: I wasn't always a pediatric nurse. I started college as a pre-law student. I spent 2 years working at a legal aid clinic before switching to nursing because I wanted to help people more directly. I knew my way around contracts, property law, and public records. I also wasn't as alone as they thought. My father might have been distant, but he was a retired accountant with friends in interesting places. Jennifer's brother was a real estate attorney. My coworker Denise had an uncle who worked in local government. Over 5 years of being treated like garbage, I'd quietly built a network. And I'd been documenting everything. Every text message from Helen. Every email from Patricia. Every time Marcus promised change and failed to deliver. Every appointment I'd missed, every obligation I'd filled, every moment I'd been treated as less than human. I had it all saved in a cloud drive they didn't know existed. But documentation wasn't enough. I needed leverage. Real, undeniable leverage. 3 months ago, during one of Helen's dinner parties, I'd overheard Richard and Harold discussing something in Richard's study. I'd been looking for aspirin in the upstairs bathroom when their voices carried through the heating vents. They were worried about inspections. Something about the construction company's recent projects. Corners being cut. Permits being approved without proper oversight. Money changing hands. I'd frozen, aspirin bottle in hand, and listened to them discuss the details of bribing a city inspector named Doug Pearson. They mentioned specific buildings, specific amounts, specific dates. Harold joked about how much they'd saved by using substandard materials on the affordable housing development in Pilsen. The affordable housing development. The one Marcus had been so excited about in the beginning, before his family had twisted it into a profit engine. The one that was supposed to help low-income families. The one where they'd cut every possible corner to maximize returns. Marcus had come home so enthusiastic about that project 2 years ago. He'd shown me the blueprints, talked about sustainable design and community impact. He'd actually seemed like the man I'd married, passionate about something beyond his family's approval. Then the project got handed to his father's company, and everything changed. Marcus stopped mentioning it. When I asked about the progress, he'd brush me off or change the subject. I'd assumed the project had stalled or been cancelled. Turns out it had been completed, just not the way Marcus had envisioned. The families who'd moved into that development trusted that the building was safe. They trusted the inspections, the permits, the official stamps of approval. They had no idea they were living in structures built with inferior materials, where fire safety had been compromised for profit, where Richard and Harold had literally stolen from the poor to line their already full pockets. I couldn't unknow what I'd heard. Every time I saw Richard at family dinners, I thought about those families. Every time Harold made a crude joke and expected me to laugh, I thought about the children living in those unsafe buildings. And every time Marcus defended his family's business practices, I wondered who he'd become. I'd gone home and said nothing. But I'd started digging. Public records showed the inspection reports. They were glowing, spotless. Too perfect. I cross-referenced them with the inspector's other projects and found the pattern. Buildings owned or developed by companies with ties to the Caldwell family always passed with flying colors, even when similar structures in the same neighborhoods failed. I'd made copies of everything. I'd recorded conversations on my phone when I could. I'd taken photos of documents left carelessly on Richard's desk. I'd built a case, piece by piece, because somewhere deep down I knew I'd eventually need it. The evidence collected slowly over those 3 months. I discovered that Helen kept financial records in her home office, filed in cabinets she assumed nobody would ever look through. During one of the dinner parties where I was relegated to kitchen duty, I'd excused myself to use the bathroom and instead slipped into that office. The files were meticulously organized, which made Helen's carelessness even more shocking. She'd documented everything: payments to inspectors, falsified expense reports, even handwritten notes about which city officials were cooperative. I photographed page after page using my phone, my hands shaking with adrenaline. Every footstep in the hallway made my heart race. But nobody came. Why would they? The help wouldn't dare go through Helen's personal belongings. Except this help had stopped caring about Helen's rules. Patricia's laptop proved another valuable source. She'd left it open on the kitchen counter one evening, logged into the family's shared business accounts. I'd memorized the passwords while pretending to wipe down the counters. Later, I'd accessed those accounts from my own computer and downloaded financial statements going back 5 years. The money trail was damning: payments to shell companies, transfers to offshore accounts, consulting fees paid to people who didn't exist. Marcus had access to everything too, of course. His laptop sat on his desk at home, password protected but easy enough to crack. He used his mother's birthday, which told me everything I needed to know about his priorities. His email contained correspondence about the Pilsen development, including discussions about cutting corners and falsifying inspection reports. He'd objected initially, I'll give him that. But his objections had been weak, easily overruled by his father. And then he'd gone along with everything, cashing his paychecks and pretending his hands were clean. After Jennifer drove me to her apartment, after I showered and sat wrapped in a borrowed robe at her kitchen table, I opened my laptop and sent some emails. One went to my father's friend at the Illinois Department of Revenue. One went to Jennifer's brother, the real estate attorney. One went to a reporter I'd met at a hospital charity event who'd given me her card and said to call if I ever had a story. Then I accessed the security system at Marcus's and my house. Yes, our house had cameras. Yes, I knew all the passwords. Yes, I'd learned how to access the system remotely after Helen had let herself in one too many times while I was at work. The cameras covered the front door, the back door, the living room, and the garage. I changed all the locks remotely using our smart home system. I changed the garage code. I changed the security system password. Then I downloaded every piece of footage from the past year onto my cloud drive and deleted the local copies. Finally, I crafted a very careful email to Marcus. No emotion. Just facts. I told him I was filing for divorce. I told him I'd documented his family's construction violations and bribery. I told him I had evidence of tax fraud from the personal returns I'd helped prepare. I told him every detail of Helen's abuse, Patricia's violence, and his own complicity. I told him I'd shared everything with appropriate authorities. Then I added one more thing: I consulted with Jennifer's brother. Illinois is an equitable distribution state. Given that I'd contributed to the household, sacrificed career opportunities to support his family's business, and endured documented abuse, I was entitled to a significant portion of marital assets. The house we lived in? Purchased partially with my nursing income during our marriage. The car in my name? Mine. The joint bank accounts? Half of everything. But here's where it got interesting. I discovered that Richard had put the house in Marcus's name 3 years ago as a gift to avoid estate taxes. Technically, it was Marcus's separate property. However, I'd paid the mortgage for the last 18 months while Marcus funneled his salary into his family's business. My attorney would argue that I'd transmuted separate property into marital property through my contributions. I'd also learned that Helen's beloved Winnetka mansion had some interesting liens against it. The construction company had borrowed heavily against the property. If the company faced legal troubles or financial penalties, that house could be seized to satisfy debts. Richard had given Marcus and me a substantial down payment on our house 3 years ago, calling it an early inheritance gift. The remaining mortgage was in both our names, but I'd been making the full payments for the last 18 months while Marcus funneled his entire salary into the family business. My attorney would argue that my solo contributions had given me a larger stake in the property. I hit send on the email at 11:47 p.m. According to the security cameras, they'd returned home around 11:15. I watched Marcus's face when he checked his phone. He went pale. He showed Helen the screen. She started screaming immediately. They tried the front door. The lock didn't work. They tried the garage. The code had changed. Marcus called me 17 times. I didn't answer. Helen called me 23 times, each call going straight to voicemail. The voicemails started angry and devolved into panicked. By 1 a.m., they were sitting in the driveway in their car. My car, actually. The Mercedes that was in my name because Helen had insisted I needed to look the part when running her errands. I'd already reported it as in my possession to the insurance company, with documentation that Marcus had been the primary driver without permission. At 2 a.m., Marcus sent a text that said, "Please. We can talk about this. I'm sorry. Too little, too late, too empty." By morning, the reporter I'd contacted had started making calls. The Department of Revenue had opened an investigation. The city's building department had announced surprise inspections of all recent Caldwell construction projects. And my attorney had filed emergency motions for a restraining order against Helen, Patricia, and Marcus, citing the assault and battery from the dinner party. Jennifer's apartment building had security cameras. She'd given me permission to list her address as my temporary residence. Any attempt by the Caldwell family to contact or approach me would be documented and used as evidence of harassment. I went to work for my Monday shift like nothing had happened. 2 detectives showed up during my lunch break. They asked about the assault. I showed them the photos Jennifer had taken of my injuries, the handprint bruise on my face, the bald patches where Patricia had ripped out my hair, the bruises on my back from her kicks. I gave them the names of 17 witnesses. The detectives asked if I wanted to press charges. I said yes. They told me the process would take time, but given the photographic evidence and the number of witnesses, they'd prioritize the case. My attorney had already filed emergency protective orders that morning, which a judge had granted by early afternoon given the documented violence and my fear of further harm. Helen Caldwell was arrested on Tuesday morning for battery. Patricia was arrested Wednesday afternoon for assault. The charges wouldn't stick, probably. Rich people rarely face consequences. But the mugshots were public record. The humiliation was real. And the lawyers I'd consulted assured me that criminal charges strengthened my civil case. The speed of the arrest surprised even my attorney. Apparently, having 17 witnesses from prominent families, clear photographic evidence, and victims willing to testify on the record made the police department surprisingly efficient. Helen's attorney tried to argue it was an accident, but soup doesn't accidentally pour itself over someone's head. Patricia's claim of just escorting her out fell apart when witnesses described the hair pulling and repeated kicks. Marcus showed up at the hospital on Thursday. Security escorted him out. He'd violated the protective order. Another charge. Another piece of evidence. Another nail in the coffin of his credibility. The construction company's problems multiplied. The city's building department ordered immediate inspections of all recent Caldwell construction projects. The inspections found exactly what I'd suspected: substandard materials, unpermitted work, falsified safety reports. The affordable housing development in Pilsen was condemned. 43 families lost their homes. My heart broke for them, but this wasn't my fault. The Caldwells had done this. I'd simply turned on the lights. Federal investigators got involved when the bribery allegations surfaced, though this process took several weeks to fully develop. Doug Pearson, the city inspector, accepted a plea deal and testified against Richard and Harold. The company faced millions in fines. The family's assets were frozen pending investigation. The reporter wrote a series of articles about corruption in Chicago's construction industry. The Caldwell family became the face of everything wrong with the system. Helen's charity board positions evaporated. Patricia's friends stopped returning her calls. Marcus's architectural license came under review. And me? I stayed with Jennifer for 2 weeks while I found my own apartment. Nothing fancy, just a one-bedroom in Lincoln Park within walking distance of the hospital. I furnished it with items from thrift stores and estate sales. Every piece I chose was something I actually liked, not something Helen had approved. The divorce moved forward. Marcus tried to negotiate. His attorney proposed a settlement. I'd drop the criminal complaints and accept $50,000. Jennifer's brother laughed in their faces. We countered with the house, both cars, half of all retirement accounts, and $750,000 for pain and suffering. They settled for the house, my car, 40% of retirement accounts, and $400,000. Marcus kept his car and whatever equity remained for my claims. The settlement was generous, but my attorney argued successfully that the documented abuse, my solo mortgage payments, and Marcus's complicity in his family's treatment of me warranted more than a standard 50-50 split. The house alone was worth $900,000. Marcus could have it, along with the memories of bringing his wife there while his mother held the leash. I pressed charges for the assault. Helen pleaded no contest and received probation plus community service. Patricia fought the charges and lost. She got 60 days in county jail, suspended sentence, and anger management classes. Neither apology felt sincere when their attorneys forced them to write letters for the sentencing hearing. The construction company declared bankruptcy. Richard and Harold faced federal charges that would drag through courts for years. They'd probably make plea deals, pay fines, and escape prison time. The system protects wealthy white men. But their empire crumbled. The family name became poison. 6 months after that dinner party, I'm sitting in my own apartment, soup-free and surrounded by peace. My face healed. My hair grew back. The nightmares faded. I kept working at the hospital, holding babies and comforting parents and doing work that actually mattered. Marcus sends emails sometimes. They start with "I've been thinking" and end with "we could try again." I delete them without reading past the first line. You don't come back from choosing your abusive mother over your wife. You don't recover from standing silent while your sister commits assault. Some bridges don't just burn, they collapse into the river and are swept out to sea. My father called after the news stories ran. He apologized for not being present, for not protecting me from his own failed judgment when I'd needed guidance. He offered to visit. I told him maybe next year. Some relationships require time to rebuild. Jennifer became my family. Her apartment turned into home base while I healed. We watched terrible movies and ordered takeout and talked about nothing and everything. She never asked for repayment or gratitude. She just showed up, which was more than my husband had ever done. The other nurses at the hospital treated me like a hero. I wasn't. I was just a woman who finally said enough. But they'd all been there, the demanding mother-in-law, the spineless husband, the slow erosion of self. My story was their story, wearing different names and faces. I started dating again last month. Nothing serious, just coffee and conversations. It feels strange to sit across from someone who asks about my day and actually listens to the answer. Strange to have someone offer to split the check instead of expecting me to serve them. Strange to be treated like a person instead of a servant. Helen's friends ask me sometimes how I could destroy a family. They corner me at the grocery store or the pharmacy, dripping with judgment. I destroyed nothing. I simply stopped maintaining the fiction that abuse was love, that servitude was marriage, that silence was peace. The Caldwell family destroyed themselves. I just stepped out of the blast radius. People ask if I regret it. The answer is complicated. I regret marrying Marcus without seeing who he really was. I regret ignoring the red flags. I regret wasting 5 years on a man who valued his mother's approval over his wife's humanity. But I don't regret leaving. I don't regret fighting back. I don't regret showing them that actions have consequences. Sometimes I drive past the old house. There's a for sale sign in the yard now. Marcus couldn't afford the mortgage without my income. Helen couldn't bail him out with her assets frozen. The house sits empty, a monument to their arrogance. I don't stop. I just drive past and feel nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no lingering attachment. It's just a building where I used to live, back when I was someone else. Someone smaller. Someone who believed that love meant sacrifice and family meant suffering. The tomato bisque smell is gone from my hair. The bruises faded months ago. But I carry something new, the knowledge that I'm stronger than I thought. That I deserved better than I received. That walking away from a burning building doesn't make you an arsonist. Helen Caldwell slapped me and poured soup on my head. Patricia dragged me by my hair and kicked my back. Marcus told me to obey or leave. Harold said women need physical lessons. So I left. And I taught them a different kind of lesson entirely. The shocking surprise that awaited them wasn't revenge. It was consequence. It was the natural result of treating another human being like property. It was the bill coming due after years of taking without giving. They thought I was weak because I was kind. They thought I was stupid because I was patient. They thought I had nowhere to go because I'd been isolated. They were wrong on every count. I'm not writing this for sympathy. I'm writing this because someone else is reading this right now, sitting at a table, serving soup to people who don't respect her. Someone else is being told to apologize for existing, to shrink herself smaller, to accept abuse as affection. Someone else is making excuses for a partner who should be her defender but has become her warden. This is for her. You are not crazy. You are not overreacting. You deserve better. And you are stronger than you know. Document everything. Build your network. Plan your exit. Then execute it with precision and without mercy. Because sometimes the only way to save yourself is to burn down everything that's crushing you. And sometimes the people who call that cruelty are the same ones who called your suffering love. I learned that lesson in Helen Caldwell's dining room, with tomato bisque in my hair and my husband's voice telling me to obey. Best education I ever received.